With Sophie leaning against the counter and her stepdad, Alex, standing a few feet away, the kitchen was filled with the soft hum of the refrigerator. He spoke in a low, nearly tremulous voice. "Sophie, you are no longer a child. I can actually see you." The weight of his words hung in the air as he drew closer, causing her to freeze and catch her breath. He muttered, "Tell me if I've crossed the queue," while she held onto the counter with her hands. Alex has always been seen by Sophie as the family's pillar of support. 5 years prior, he had married her mother, blending in with them and giving Sophie the stability she had not had since her father's departure. He was easy to like, perhaps too easily, because he was patient, kind, and naturally charming. Sophie didn't start to notice anything unusual until she got home from her summer break at college. Alex's comments were more intimate, his looks lingered a bit too long, and he appeared more attentive than normal. She initially dismissed it, telling herself she was having hallucinations. However, it was impossible to overlook the tension that existed between them. Sophie was left alone with Alex one evening after her mother left on a business trip. The environment felt different without her mother present, even though they had usually gotten along well. Alex placed the lasagna on the table and stated, "I made it. I assumed that after finals you would be sick of takeout." Sophie grinned as the gesture warmed her heart. "Thank you, Alex. That is very considerate." They had the kind of easy discussion that Sophie rarely had with her mother while they were eating. Alex inquired about her coursework, her future goals, and even related anecdotes from his own time in college. But as the night wore on, Sophie noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way his tone grew quieter, more intimate. She felt her pulse quicken, but didn't dare acknowledge the shift. After dinner, Sophie retreated to the kitchen to clean up, hoping the task would distract her from the strange feelings bubbling up inside her. She was scrubbing a plate when Alex appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a drink in his hand. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice low. "I don't mind," she replied, not looking up. He stepped closer, the air between them growing thick. "You've grown up so much, Sophie," he said, his tone soft but weighted. She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she set the plate in the drying rack. "Thanks, I guess," she said, forcing a laugh. Alex didn't laugh. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I mean it. You're not a kid anymore. You're this incredible woman." Her breath hitched as she turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Alex, what are you saying?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I know this is wrong," he admitted, his gaze locking onto hers, "but I can't stop seeing you the way I do." Sophie's chest tightened as his words sank in. "We can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his tone raw. "But tell me you haven't felt it too." She opened her mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself staring at him, her heart racing as the tension between them threatened to boil over. "Alex," she began. But he interrupted her, stepping even closer. "Tell me if I've crossed the line," he whispered, his breath warm against her cheek. "Tell me to stop, and I will." Her hands gripped the counter behind her as her mind raced. She knew she should tell him to leave, to end this before it went any further. But when his hand brushed hers, a spark shot through her, and she couldn't bring herself to pull away. The space between them disappeared as Alex leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was hesitant but filled with unspoken longing. Sophie's resolve crumbled as she responded, her hand sliding up his chest as their kiss deepened. "You're incredible," Alex murmured against her lips, his hand settling on her waist. "And you're crazy," she whispered back, her voice trembling as her fingers tangled in his shirt. The night unfolded in a haze of passion, the boundaries between them dissolving as they gave in to the pull they had both been fighting. The quiet hum of the house became their cocoon, shielding them from the world outside as they explored the depths of their connection. Sophie woke to the soft light of dawn streaming through the curtains. The events of the night before rushed back, and a wave of guilt crashed over her. She sat up, clutching the blanket around her as she glanced at Alex, who was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. "This was a mistake," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I know," he replied, his tone heavy, "but it didn't feel like one." Before she could respond, The sound of her mom's car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of panic through both of them. "She's home early," Sophie whispered, her heart racing. Alex stood quickly, his face pale as he grabbed his clothes. "We'll talk later," he said urgently before slipping out of the room. Sophie tried to compose herself as her mom walked through the door, her cheery voice filling the house. "I'm back. Did you two survive without me?" She forced a smile, her chest tightening as Alex appeared in the hallway, his expression calm, but his eyes betraying his unease. "We managed," he said with a faint smile, his gaze briefly meeting Sophie's before looking away. But as the days passed, the weight of their secret grew heavier, the tension between them threatening to unravel the facade they had carefully constructed. And while they both vowed to move forward, the memory of that night lingered, a forbidden connection neither of them could forget. Sophie couldn't shake the memory of that night. Every time she saw Alex, her heart raced, torn between guilt and the undeniable pull she still felt. He tried to act normal when her mom was around, but the stolen glances, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her, it was all too much to ignore. Her mom seemed blissfully unaware, carrying on with her usual routines, but Sophie felt as though she was living on the edge of a precipice, waiting for everything to come crashing down. A week after that night, Sophie found herself awake late, unable to sleep. She crept downstairs for a glass of water, only to find Alex sitting in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "You're up late," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a silence between them, heavy and loaded. Sophie hesitated, then stepped closer, taking a seat on the couch across from him. "We need to talk," she said finally. "I know," Alex replied, his voice strained. "I've been trying to figure out what to say." She looked down at her hands, her thoughts swirling. That night, it shouldn't have happened, but it did, and now I don't know how to move forward. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Sophie, I can't change what happened, but I need you to know it wasn't just a moment of weakness for me. It meant something." Her breath caught at his words. "Alex, this is so complicated. We can't—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice filled with emotion. "But I can't stop thinking about you. About us." Sophie's heart pounded as she looked into his eyes. "What are we supposed to do, Alex? Pretend it never happened? Keep lying to Mom?" "I don't have an answer," he admitted, his gaze steady. "But I can't go back to pretending nothing's changed. Not when every time I see you, He trailed off, his voice faltering. She swallowed hard, her emotions warring within her. "This is wrong," she whispered, though her body betrayed her, leaning closer to him. "I know," he said, his hand reaching out to brush hers, "but that doesn't make it any less real." The distance between them disappeared as Alex cupped her face, his touch igniting the same fire that had consumed them before. Sophie didn't resist as his lips met hers, the kiss deep and filled with the weight of their unspoken feelings. Her hands found his shoulders, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened, their restraint crumbling under the intensity of their connection. "You're incredible," he murmured against her lips, his voice thick with desire. "And you're impossible," she replied, her voice trembling as her fingers tangled in his shirt. The living room became their haven, the quiet of the night enveloping them as they gave in once more to the pull between them. Sophie woke the next morning to the sound of her mom humming in the kitchen. Panic set in as she realized she'd fallen asleep on the couch. She glanced at Alex, who was already awake, his expression a mix of worry and resolve. "We can't keep doing this," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his hand brushing hers, "but what we feel isn't going away. We need to figure out what this means. For us, for her." Sophie nodded, her heart heavy as she got up and headed upstairs to compose herself. Later that day, Sophie's mom called a family meeting, her tone unusually serious. Sophie and Alex exchanged a nervous glance as they joined her in the living room. "I've been thinking a lot about us," her mom began, her voice steady but emotional. "About how we've all been distant lately." Sophie's stomach churned as her mom's gaze lingered on her. "I just want to make sure we're all okay," her mom continued. "I've noticed things have felt different." Alex cleared his throat, his voice calm. "Everything's fine," he said smoothly. We're just adjusting to being home together again." Her mom nodded, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "If there's ever anything we need to talk about, we should. I want us to be honest with each other." Sophie forced a smile, her chest tightening under the weight of their secret. As the day went on, Sophie and Alex found themselves caught in a dangerous dance, their feelings pulling them closer even as the risk of discovery loomed larger. And while they both knew the consequences could be devastating, neither of them could deny the connection that had changed everything. The unease of their family meeting lingered in the air, casting a shadow over the rest of the day. Sophie's nerves were frayed as she retreated to her room, her thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, desire, and fear. She couldn't focus on anything. Her mom's words, Alex's subtle glances, the constant fear of being discovered. It was all too much. Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of their secret pressed heavily on her chest. When she heard a soft knock at her door, her heart jumped. "Come in," she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. His expression was tense, his jaw tight as he leaned against the frame. "Sophie," he began, his voice low. "We can't keep doing this." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her. "I know," she said softly. "But what are we supposed to do? Pretend it didn't happen? Pretend it doesn't matter?" "Cross the problem." He crossed the room, his presence filling the small space. "It does matter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the problem." Sophie stood, her pulse racing as she faced him. "Then what do we do, Alex? What do you want me to say?" He reached out, his hand brushing her arm. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "All I know is I can't stop thinking about you." Her breath hitched, her resolve crumbling as she stepped closer. "Then stop pretending," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His gaze darkened, the tension between them snapping like a taut wire. "Sophie," he murmured, his hand moving to cup her face. "This could destroy everything." She didn't respond. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips capturing his in a kiss that was desperate, filled with everything they couldn't say. The kiss deepened, their hands tangling as they gave in completely. Alex guided her back to the bed, his touch firm but reverent, as if he couldn't believe she was real. Sophie's hands slid under his shirt, her fingers exploring the planes of his chest as their connection ignited into something neither of them could control. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "And you're dangerous," she replied, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and longing. The world outside ceased to exist as they lost themselves in each other, their actions reckless and raw. The quiet hum of the house became their sanctuary, shielding them from the consequences that loomed just beyond the walls of her room. As the early morning light began to filter through the curtains, Sophie stirred, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had done. Alex was already awake, his hand lightly brushing hers as he sat beside her. "We need to talk," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. But before they could say another word, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made Sophie's stomach drop. Her mom's voice called out from the other side of the door, cheerful and unsuspecting. "Sophie, are you awake?" Panic flashed across Alex's face as he scrambled to gather his clothes. Sophie sat frozen, her heart racing as the doorknob began to turn. The door opened just as Alex disappeared into the adjoining bathroom. Her mom stepped inside, her brow furrowing at the sight of Sophie sitting on the edge of her bed, her cheeks flushed. "Are you okay?" her mom asked, concern flickering across her face. "Yeah," Sophie said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just couldn't sleep." Her mom nodded, her gaze lingering for a moment before she turned to leave. "Well, get some rest. We've got a busy day ahead." As the door clicked shut, Sophie let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. Alex emerged from the bathroom moments later, his face pale. "We can't keep this up," he said urgently. "We have to stop." Sophie looked at him, her chest tightening. "But can we?" His silence was answer enough.